Indonesia, an archipelago nation of over 17,000 islands, with a population of around 270 million people. The country is home to hundreds of ethnicities, cultures, languages, and religions. Indonesia's wildlife is perhaps the world's richest and most diverse. Still to be found in parts of the vast nation are Asian elephants, orangutans, leopards, bears, and endemic species such as Javanese rhinos, Sumatran tigers, and Komodo dragons. Indonesia's plant life is also among the world's richest and most diverse. Just over half of the country is still covered by forest, including almost 8% of the world's remaining primary forest.
Karena pertama, seperti kita lihat di sekeliling kita, ini adalah hutan rawa gambut, salah satu yang terbesar, ekosistem rawa gambut terbesar di Indonesia, yang fungsinya luar biasa untuk menyerap karbon, dan dalam krisis iklim saat ini sangat penting untuk mempertahankan keberadaannya. Kedua, dia adalah merupakan habitat orangutan. Dan juga bagi EIA ini merupakan tempat pertama kali EIA dan juga Telapak memulai kampanye illegal logging.
Following a severe economic crisis, Indonesia's dictator of over 30 years, Haji Muhammad Suharto, is forced to step down. For decades, the country's very lucrative logging sector has been controlled by Suharto and his cronies. Suharto's personal wealth is believed to be in the region of $38 billion. Almost overnight, central government's iron grip on the country disappears.
The fall of Suharto had created chaos. There was a power vacuum as the highly centralized military Javanese dictatorship fell apart, with all the very, very hierarchical systems controlled from Java out right across the archipelago. All of that was starting to unravel, and there was burgeoning corruption at multiple levels.
El Niño causes some of the worst forest fires Indonesia has ever seen. Millions of hectares of forest are destroyed. Alarmed at some of the reports they hear, a small team of British activists from EIA begin a fact-finding mission.
We went over to Borneo and we were trying to find out what was really going on. There was an El Niño going on, there were fires everywhere, we knew this, but why and what was happening and what was being done about it. And we drove sometimes for hours across an area that had been thick forest and was now just a mess. It was black, it was dark, you actually felt it as you went through it. It was devoid of any life.
The Environmental Investigation Agency is an NGO based in London. Its mission is to protect, respect and celebrate the natural world for the benefit of all. EIA uses a combination of video investigation, advocacy and campaigning to pursue its goals. The forest fires continue to rage. millions more hectares of forest are destroyed. The impact on people and wildlife is immense.
We talked to people about the wildlife in the area, of which there wasn't any anymore because it had been burnt out. But they told us of stories of orangutans, for instance, that would be racing away from the fires to try and escape. And the area is littered with water and rivers and canals, too, that have been built. And if a orangutan comes against water, it can't swim. And so the orangutans were just being burnt to death. And the people there, the Dayaks, they felt it was the heart of the place had gone, the soul of the place had gone.
In London, EIA released their first report on the crisis in Indonesia's forests. The politics of extinction outlines how corruption, nepotism, lack of governance, high timber prices and a huge thirst for land for palm oil plantations all contribute to the accelerated destruction of Indonesia's remaining forests and the shrinking habitat of the country's wildlife.
Putting out our report at the time, The Politics of Extinction, was really more of a response than an actual decision. Once we'd published our report, we took stock again. It had been a good scoping trip. We'd learnt a lot. We got a good feel for how we might be able to operate in Indonesia.
Back in 1967, Suharto had pushed through a law which transferred control of most of the country's land to the state.
I arrived in Indonesia 6 months after Suharto fell. The government of Indonesia invited the UK government to work with it, to see what could be done to sort out the problems in the forest sector.
Using the forest fires as cover, criminal gangs and timber mafias move into many of the country's national parks. Protected under the Suharto regime, these are places of great beauty, biodiversity and ecological importance. Most are primary forests, abundant with mature hardwoods and established populations of wildlife. Primary forests, also termed primeval, virgin and old growth, are naturally regenerating ancient forests of native tree species. They exhibit advanced and unique ecological features and display few signs of human activity or impact.
We were looking by then for a partner, and we felt also that we'd met in Telapak, an organisation that had not just the same ideas in terms of what could go forward, but that we could help with the investigative side and they could help us with understanding how to move forward within Indonesia.
Ayo jalan bareng, kerja bareng, seru-seru. Kupikir itu yang satu-satu. Ya, alasan kedua adalah alasan yang misalnya memang kejahatan kehutanan, penghancuran hutan yang terjadi itu rasanya Telapak dan EIA bisa berbuat sesuatu. Jadi kami beruntung lah Telapak ya, yang baru mulai, belum tahu apa-apa gitu kan. Terus ketemu, terus memperoleh ilmu, memperoleh cara pandang, cara lihat, dan cara kerja, keterampilan yang sangat tajam itu.
Telapak was founded in Bogor near Jakarta in the mid-90s by a group of students studying environment-related subjects. The name translates from Bahasa as footprint. The organisation's remit is to advocate for the just and sustainable management of Indonesia's natural resources and to create and sustain a nationwide network of environmentally active people.
We decided rather to go for everything, we would focus on one thing, and that was illegal logging.
Telapak had some good up-to-date information about the situation on the ground in central Kalimantan, where this national park called Tanjung Puting we'd heard was being heavily logged. And the reason we were interested in Tanjung Puting is it was a globally famous nature reserve, and it had a very famous population of orangutans. And we felt that if logging could be so brazen in a place like that, then Indonesia's forests would be lost.
For most of the next year, joint teams from EIA and Telapak investigate forest crime around Indonesia. They focus on the national parks of Borneo and Sumatra. teams are using EIA's relatively new methodology, video investigation. Sony's new format DV camcorder is a technological leap and a game changer in the industry. It's small, robust and easy to use, and becomes their weapon of choice in their fight to save Indonesia's remaining forests.
Jadi yang pertama-tama ngajari cara memotret dan memvideokan itu Dave tuh. Jadi di telapak kantor telapak yang lama ada sofa merah itu kan. Dave duduk di sini, saya duduk di sini, terus ini kamera. Nah, sedangkan tentang teknis kamera itu hanya dikasih tahu, oh ini cekrek. Yang lain-lainnya saya hanya nggak ada yang perlu ingat itu. Jadi intinya kan, apa intinya ya? Kalau video intinya jangan goyang-goyang gitu doang. Salah.
Ketika kita tidak dapat mengendalikan, baik dengan regulasi maupun dengan aparat keamanan, dalam hal ini polisi dan polisi kehutanan, maka pelibatan civil society, masyarakat dimungkinkan.
One of the first joint research trips is to the Tanjung Puting National Park in southern Borneo.
Investigators found illegal logging in every part of the park. The area has been divided up by illegal loggers, and even trucks are used on roads built by loggers within the park boundaries. Logging rails, used to move the logs out, were discovered throughout the area. Piles of valuable ramen logs are stored along the river, and logging camps litter the riverbank. At the mouth of the river, in full view of the authorities, logs are loaded onto large steel barges. The kingpin in these activities is timber baron Abdul Rasid, who owns factories on the nearby Arat River and has close links with the military and police. Mr. Rasid's nephew, Sugianto, showed one of the factories to EIA and Telapak investigators who were posing as businessmen. Part of the Tanjung Lingga company group, this ramen factory loads unmarked ramen from rafts, dries it in drying rooms and processes it into mouldings and blinds for export to Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan and the USA.
Responding to new information, the team then travel on to the Losa ecosystem in northern Sumatra.
EIA and Telapak investigators followed illegal loggers into the national park and filmed them preparing their logging camp. Loggers are paid a few dollars per day by the sawmill owners and are supplied the chainsaw and a repayable loan which binds them to these powerful businessmen. Investigators followed logging trucks to the local sawmills.
It's the big men that have to be gone after. That's the sawmill owners, the people that own the factories, and those people within the authorities, the military, the police, the forest department, who are also making money out of this.
EIA and Telepak's work in Indonesia is getting noticed.
I bumped into Dave Curry in a very remote area of forests in Aceh with his Indonesian colleagues and thought, you know, this must be one of the few organizations, international organizations, in partnership with Indonesian groups who was really documenting what was really happening in places where, you know, few people were going. EIA was willing to get its boots dirty, get off the beaten track.
This area has the highest density of orangutans anywhere in the world.
The final cut is launched at a press conference in Jakarta. The report and accompanying video investigation stun everyone present and around the country.
And the report was very hard-hitting, it named names, it did all this kind of stuff. Now, they'd never seen that kind of press conference ever before in Indonesia. Remember, it had been a dictatorship. There was oppression about all of that. This was the first time an environmental group had come and given this kind of presentation with the evidence, with the photos, with the video, with the names. And it was so well attended. We had CNN, we had BBC, we had Reuters, we had all the big internationals were there, but the locals were there too.
I was sitting at the back, and Indonesians were, I think, gobsmacked. They had come out of a 30-year dictatorship where the press had been constrained. You only saw state-controlled TV. So a lot of people, certainly those living in the city of Jakarta on Java, had no idea of what was going down in their forests. And they were not used to frank, open conversation and expose of things. And it had a huge impact on them. I think that was the beginning of a sort of real awakening of some kind of environmental awareness, but also a sense that this was their resource and it had been stolen from them.
It was a good time for us to be bringing in our call for action to the government, and we made it very clear that if you can't take action in Tanjung Puting, then you can't save any forest in Indonesia, because Tanjung Puting was so well known and it was so brazen what was going on. It was just outright robbery.
Kami kontak pertama kali dengan IAIA ya, Telapak, ketika menyajikan film yang film yang termasuk berani.
Now established as credible and serious players, EIA and Telapak decide to continue their partnership.
So the final cut opened doors for us. Telapak and EIA were taken seriously now, were people that knew about these issues. We could talk to diplomatic missions, we could talk to other NGOs, we could talk to the media. We were a serious part of the game, if you like.
Encouraged by the country's growing civil society, the Indonesian government agrees to bilateral talks with the UK, aimed at combating illegal logging.
Lalu dari David, ya saya ingat, saya lupa namanya, oke kita kembangkan proyek kerjasama. Lebih baik kita melakukan kerjasama daripada saling mencela.
Several newly formed NGOs from around Indonesia contact EIA and Telapak, asking to be trained in their methods of on-the-ground video investigation.
We realized that the training that we could give to groups all around the country would motivate them, would mobilize them in their own way, for their own issues, for a long time to come.
And so it occurred to us, really, that the UK government would get good value for money, if you like, if we were to support EIA to train up, 40, 50 or more Indonesians to use video cameras in their investigations, be able to date and spatially locate the film so that it could be used as evidence, not just in exposés and in greater transparency, the reports that EIA were doing, but for evidence that could be used in legal processes.
The NGOs develop and roll out a series of basic field training workshops.
We sort of go out to the regions and bring together 10 or 15 local NGOs, and we show them basic use of photography and film and some undercover techniques and safety and security, which would embolden them and give them the skills they needed to start campaigning against illegal logging in their areas.
And because Telapak had such a fantastic network of people over the country, it was going to prove over the years to come a vital part of information coming in, photographs coming in, video coming in.
Over the next 8 years, EIA and Telapak run many similar and more advanced training courses for NGOs all around the country.
It wasn't just about learning how to use a camera. It had opened up all kinds of possibilities in the minds of the youth participants in these workshops about what they could do with their lives.
Dan beberapa organisasi terutama yang memang menunjukkan minat dan kapasitas untuk menjadi semacam service provider, EIA dan Telapak kemudian memberikan pelatihan lanjutan yaitu berupa pelatihan editing. Sehingga mereka bisa mengemas informasi-informasi dan bukti-bukti yang mereka peroleh dari investigasi lapangan mereka menjadi produk kampanye yang bisa dilakukan untuk kampanye mereka di tingkat daerah ataupun nasional ataupun internasional sebetulnya.
Over the next year, EIA and Telapak dispatched teams of investigators on numerous field trips to Sumatra and Borneo. Their mission is to gather video evidence of the by now rampant illegal logging taking place in the country's national parks. One team returns to Tanjung Puting to see if illegal logging in the national park has stopped or tailed off following the release of the final cut. As their investigation comes to an end, events take a turn.
Kemudian kami berpikir kita perlu informasi dari tangan pertama, dari sasaran investigasi utama itu yaitu Tanjung Liga Group, Rasid, dan organisasinya atau grupnya lah gitu. Jadi kemudian kami untuk mengunjungi sawmillnya.
Going to Java?
Rui and I both made calls, me to London to say we were going to go and meet them. And he rang the office in Bogor with Telapak. And we got into this Jeep, the doors locked, and off we went. And we ended up at the Tanjung Linga office.
Berhenti di depan, terus masuk, ada tangga naik ke lantai 2. Jadi kami ke lantai 2 dan kemudian disuruh masuk ke ruangan di situ. Ternyata itu ruangan kerja Sugianto. Dan disitulah tiba-tiba kami tahu bahwa kami bukan akan berbincang-bincang atau interview atau apa, tapi justru disekap.
The minute he saw Rui, he went ballistic. He went absolutely ballistic and said, "You lied, you came into my warehouse, you did this, you did that." The whole thing really started to escalate. I mean, it just went from walking in the room to zip. There was a lot of violence. Rui was punched and hit. There was a lot of shouting and screaming.
Dipukuli, barang-barang direbut, dirampas segala macam ya. Jadi itu dipukul dan diinjak beberapa kali, ditodong.
But the moment I really thought we were in real trouble was when Sugianto picked up his pistol and he slammed it down on the desk in front of us. And he said something like, "I can kill you now, and me, I will just go to jail, but I'll be alive," or something like that. And, by this stage, I won't lie, I was absolutely terrified.
Nah, di situ ada perasaan, inilah akhirnya hidupku gitu kan, semacam itu. Tapi mungkin hanya sedetik, 2 detik. Mereka merasa menguasai seluruh aparat ya, polisi, tentara, pemerintah itu berada di bawah kekuasaan, di bawah kendali mereka. Jadi mereka kita suruh polisi untuk sidik, untuk proses mereka biar mereka di penjara gitu-gitu ya.
I do remember being marched down the stairs, really relieved that we were out of that room, not quite sure now we were in the hands of the police whether that was a good or a bad thing. And they had a flatbed police truck and they put us on the back of that. And I was very scared then because I thought someone might shoot us or kill us on the way.
Yang datang dan membawa kami itu dari reserse. Tapi ternyata syukurlah bahwa meskipun nampaknya pada saat itu semua sudah dikuasai dan dikendalikan oleh mereka, oleh grup ini, tapi ada sekelompok kecil polisi ini, unit reserse ini, yang tidak berada di bawah, mungkin tidak mau tunduk pada keinginan, kehendak, perintah dari grup ini. Jadi mereka justru bukannya memproses kami dan menahan kami gitu ya, justru malah melindungi kami di situ. Yang pertama saya telepon adalah Minang ya, jadi mungkin waktu itu protokolnya memang begitu, jadi kontak poinnya gitu saya kemudian kasih tahu Minang. Terus kemudian komunikasi rutin bisa terjalin sehingga bisa share cerita, laporkan apa yang terjadi, dan teman-teman di Bogor, di banyak tempat kemudian bisa merencanakan dan melakukan apa-apa yang untuk penyelamatan atau evakuasi. Mungkin ketahuan bahwa bukannya kami disiksa di polisi, malah dilindungi di polisi, maka kantor polisi itu kemudian dikepung oleh preman-preman, oleh massa banyak sekali dengan bersenjata dan lain-lain mengepung kantor itu.
On the second day, when Sugianto's lawyers came with a film crew from a television station, we realized then what it was that they wanted from us. They wanted me to go on television with Rui and say that we had lied and that the final cut was all lies and we'd made it up, and that in fact Tanjung wasn't doing any of these things. Now that I knew what they wanted, I knew I wasn't going to give it to them. And what we did was I told them that I was not in a position to make a statement like that without permission from my board. And they bought it. And so that was when it started to, I realized we may be able to get out of this.
Selama 3 hari, jadi kami nggak bisa keluar, dan polisi-polisi itu juga nggak bisa keluar. Jadi itu situasinya yang terjadi.
And the situation has deteriorated again. The police are arming themselves with rifles.
Jadi disimpan di situ di ruang kepala reserse. Kalau mau ke toilet misalnya, itu ada polisi, ada petugas yang bawa senjata, nganterin sampai ke pintu gitu-gitu. Jadi waktu itu emang sangat
We've just been told that they are going to mobilize the Navy and military troops in order to help get us out.
Kantor polisi itu kemudian dikepung oleh preman-preman, oleh massa banyak sekali dengan bersenjata dan lain-lain mengepung kantor itu.
The next day, when we were told to sit in a certain place within the room that we were being held, and the next thing I know is we're being taken out of the room with bodyguards and guns and rifles around us, and we get into a jeep, and that jeep then goes to the airport.
Masuk sama-sama ke pesawat.
We got to the airport, and there were a lot of people standing alongside the runway, and there was the sight of this wonderful little plane. And we said goodbye, we got on the plane, and we got out of there. It wasn't until afterwards that we realised exactly what was going on behind the scenes and how many people were really doing so much to get us out and to save our lives.
As Indonesia's new president gets to grips with the job, he makes the decision to devolve significant powers to the regions.
Unfortunately, decentralisation made the work of the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Environment and our own work a lot harder.
Saya sudah bilang tadi ya, korupsi itu ada di mana-mana, nepotisme, kolusi gitu ya, pelanggaran hukum dibiarkan, sehingga otonomi daerah ini alih-alih bisa menjadi perbaikan, tapi yang terjadi adalah semakin merebaknya KKN ini, praktek KKN ini bahkan sampai di level yang paling rendah gitu, sehingga kita tadinya punya raja-raja koruptor cuma ada di Jakarta, tapi sekarang hampir di setiap provinsi, kabupaten ada.
CITES is an international treaty signed by most of the world's governments. It aims to prevent animal and plant species becoming endangered or extinct through trade.
Karena itu salah satu alat kita untuk melindungi, salah satu konservasi jenis-jenis yang sudah mulai punah. Karena itu diakui secara internasional dan diverifikasi. Ada forumnya di internasional ya, itu. Dan kita juga harus memberikan laporan. Jadi bagus.
The NGOs have an appointment to meet the new Minister of Forestry.
He was running late, and suddenly he came out of his office, realised we were there, and he basically said, "Walk with me, Faith. Walk and talk. Tell me what is it? What do you need?" By the time we got into the lift and downstairs, his car was waiting, and I hadn't quite got to my point. And so we jumped in the car. My colleague was in the front. I wanted a commitment from him that he would unilaterally list Ramin on CITES Appendix 3. And I explained to him, by doing this, there would be some oversight, there'd be some regulation, there'd be something there that would exist to be able to try and control this hemorrhaging of this valuable timber from the park. And he agreed. I realised then I needed more than just his word. I rummaged around in my handbag and I found this napkin and a ballpoint pen, and I got it out and I got him to sign to that commitment. I was thrilled. We got to his appointment. I got out of the car and that was it. It was job done.
The government announces a moratorium on the logging of Ramin. And a few months later, as agreed by the minister, lists Ramin on Appendix 3 of CITES. The Malaysian government responds by submitting a reservation. A reservation is a mechanism enabling a CITES member country not to observe or comply with part or all of an Appendix 3 listing. Ramin trees grow in the coastal peat swamp forests of Borneo, Sumatra and peninsular Malaysia. Since the 60s, Malaysia's timber industry has been based on the logging and processing of Ramin, a strong blonde hardwood. Malaysia's annual available supply of Ramin for processing has reduced by around 80% in the last 10 years. Despite this, however, exports of Ramin from Malaysia, sawn timber and finished products have increased significantly in the last couple of years.
Of course, they suddenly had a good supply of cheap, illegal timber coming across from neighbouring Indonesia. By 2001, we were very keen to follow the trail, the Ramin trail, you might call it, for the Ramin that's been illegally logged in Indonesia. We knew a lot of that was being smuggled into neighbouring Malaysia. Malaysia had a very big timber industry, and Ramin was a key species in that. So we decided to start looking at the supply chain and the smuggling routes that Ramin was taking to get from Indonesia to Malaysia.
After 18 months of investigations and months of putting the information together, EIA and Telapak release a follow-up report.
On just one day, EIA and Telapak investigators witnessed more than 30 Indonesian vessels carrying illegal logs arriving in the port of Muar in Malaysia. The boats were seen passing a police post and stopping at a customs jetty, once again showing official complicity. In Batu Pahat, EIA and Telapak investigators found ramen logs which had recently been imported from Sumatra in Indonesia. Such trade is illegal under the CITES listing and illustrates that Malaysia continues to flout its international obligations.
The scale was just mind-blowing in a way, and it was all being done in the open. There was no attempt to be clandestine, which shows that the Malaysian authorities weren't willing to act on this because their businesses were profiting from the destruction of neighbouring Indonesia's forests.
Given the fact that CITES had just listed Indonesian ramen on CITES Appendix 3, and we were actually completely shocked at the fact that nothing had changed.
But also in terms of economics, this sudden glut of ramen that was being smuggled via Malaysia was depressing the price on the international market because it's simple oversupply.
In part as a result of the work of EIA, Telapak and others, some governments around the world start to grasp the scale and seriousness of the explosion in illegal logging and the destruction of the world's remaining forests.
At the time, the World Bank were organising a whole series of, rather staid technocratic meetings on forest law enforcement. And I thought, this is an opportunity, to really, if we could jump on these, get hold of the agenda, we could change these into real game-changing dialogues and discussions with the real actors. Together with the Americans, I have to say, we managed to add the word governance, forest law enforcement governance, to the title.
The East Asia Ministerial Conference on Forest Law Enforcement and Governance opens in Bali. Hosted by the Indonesian government and the World Bank, and part funded by DFID and USAID, 150 delegates from 20 countries arrive in Denpasar. They represent NGOs, governments, UN agencies and the private sector. The stage is set for significant change.
And we managed to get high-level segment where consumer countries like the UK and the US and Europe would send high-level representation, because we reckon we were part of the problem, as well as top-level government officials from Indonesia, from China, and to have a large participation of civil society organisations.
The delegates are gathered for several days of discussion and debate on the future of Southeast Asia's remaining forest.
So at the end of the first day, we were all hanging out and swimming. Some people were having drinks at the bar, and there were televisions around the place, and we suddenly realised that there was something extraordinary happening.
And suddenly on the TV screens, we witnessed what people all over the world were witnessing, which was the Twin Towers coming down. It was 9/11, and we were shocked, absolutely shocked.
Almost immediately, the Indonesian police arrive. They surround and seal off the conference hotel to protect the delegates inside.
And so at that moment, it was decided that the high-level segment would be pulled forward. We would shorten the conference, but that no one would abandon the conference. Indeed, none of us were able to leave the hotel anyway for the next 24 hours. And so the conference carried on.
In the spirit of global unity, all but one of the participating countries, including China, sign a declaration of undertaking and intent on forest law enforcement and governance. It becomes known as FLEG. Malaysia refuses to sign.
So the conference went way beyond trees. It was to actually address the core issues of corruption, land rights, tenure. It was looking at illegal trade, illegal logging, but it went way beyond the trees. And that was really significant. By having these issues out in the open, we are actually getting governments to acknowledge that there was a problem in the first place.
A couple of months later, the Indonesian government implements a log export ban. From this point onwards, only sawn or processed timber can legally be exported from the country.
This was definitely good news, but as with all these things, would it be enforced would be the question. The big problem and the big loophole in all of this was that although this ban was for exports from Indonesia, it was still legal for Malaysia to import the logs.
Can I welcome everybody to this signing ceremony?
The UK and Indonesia signed the Memorandum of Understanding. They've been negotiating for over 2 years. The purpose of the MOU is to cut or curtail any involvement that the UK might have in the destruction of Indonesia's remaining forests.
The MOU was a great idea. And what it was the UK saying, look, Indonesia, you don't have to do this on your own. You know, the UK was part of the problem as well. And that MOU basically provided a way forward to look at this issue from both ends.
Smile.
However, the MOU also includes some aspects of trade.
And this puts the European Union's nose out of joint. Trade was a European Union issue and responsibility, not a member state responsibility at that time. However, it obliged them to engage and to look at what they would do to control the illegal timber coming into their bigger area from tropical forests across the world, including Indonesia.
Embarrassed by further video investigations by EIA, Telapak and others, Malaysia's federal government introduces a ban on the import of logs from Indonesia.
Dan ini sebetulnya merupakan cikal bakal atau salah satu contoh di mana negara konsumen dan negara produsen bekerja bersama gitu loh, mempunyai legislasi yang saling melengkapi untuk mengatasi illegal logging dan perdagangan kayu ilegal antar negara atau cross border.
But the Malaysian decision did not apply to the province of Sarawak in Malaysia, which is on Borneo. And so the land route for smuggling of logs across from Kalimantan, which is Indonesian Borneo, across into Sarawak, Malaysian Borneo, remained open.
From their network of NGO contacts around the country, information reaches Telapak that the timber mafias are now targeting Indonesia's Papuan provinces on the island of New Guinea.
Indonesia's Papuan forests were an obvious place for the timber mafia to go to next, because here you had huge stands of ancient forests, you had valuable hardwoods available, very little control. I mean, the area for them just must have felt like an open book to make money.
The city of Sorong, on the northwest tip of Papua, is a hotspot for the illegal logging business. Its hotels and seedy bars are where deals are struck between the timber mafia and foreign timber buyers, mostly from Malaysia, China and India. There is corruption in the local forestry office. Here, officials willingly and illegally redraw the boundaries of protected areas to suit the needs of timber companies, allowing access to valuable timber. The prime target for the loggers is the merbau tree, a threatened species with the last commercial stands found on the island of Papua. Merbau is used for flooring and furniture. Large amounts are being illegally shipped out from Sorong, despite Indonesia's log export ban. This shipping website shows consignments of merbau logs awaiting collection for delivery to China and India.
We were in Sorong, and one night A couple of guys came to see us from the Kaoem tribe, which was an indigenous tribe living in the forest. And they told us what had happened to their forest.
An amazing story about how their area had been invaded by loggers, and it was being controlled by a military police officer who had kind of threatened them, walked around with a pistol, and basically told them that, you know, this wood's going to be mine, there's nothing you can do about that.
EIA and Telapak travelled south of Sorong city, a day's journey by speedboat and on foot, to the home of the Kaoem tribe, to witness the impact of logging on traditional communities. In 3 locations in the Kaoem tribal lands, illegal merbau logging is taking place against the wishes of the community. Damage to the forest from logging roads is clear to see. EIA and Telapak observed large merbau logs awaiting collection, clearly illegal, since no official permit has been granted to log in this area.
Dan untuk lingkungan ini, perasaan untuk melihat lingkungan itu sebagai bagian yang harus dihancurkan memang tidak. Itu termasuk rumah tangga yang besar. Hubungan atau ya hubungan sebagai kearifan masyarakat adat dengan alam itu sangat menjadi kebanggaan masyarakat. Dan tatanan kehidupan masyarakat adat di sini melihat bahwa kekayaan alam yang ada itu menjadi aset utama. Sehingga di dalam pengolahannya itu sangat sederhana.
The outsider responsible for the illegal logging of this tribal land is a military police officer called Casper.
What's happening is corruption is moving in, the military are involved, the police are involved, and what's needed is that the governor of Papua actually investigates what's happening with this corruption, with the military, with the police. Staying with the Kaoem tribe that we stayed with in the village was an extraordinary feeling. There was no electricity, there was nothing there that we would be used to. But it didn't take long to really feel the wonderful sense of how that community lived as such a close-knit, caring, loving community. It rubbed off very heavily on us.
In part due to the work of EIA, Telapak and others, Western governments and consumers begin expressing concerns regarding the legality of available tropical hardwoods. Indonesia's legitimate timber industry decides to join Telapak's initiative to define the legality of timber.
Lalu kalau kita tanya, apa sih illegal logging? Nah, disitulah orang debat tentang pendefinisian itu. Dan itu lama. Definisi itu lama di dalamnya di SK Menteri, SK Dirjen tentang istilah legal itu. Lama sekali itu.
Pada tahun 2003, diskusi-diskusi seperti ini semakin banyak terjadi karena semua pihak merasa bahwa langkah awal untuk bisa menanggulangi permasalahan illegal logging adalah kejelasan terlebih dahulu. Gitu loh. Mana yang kayu legal, mana yang ilegal, sehingga penegakan hukum bisa berlangsung efektif dan juga para pelaku usaha punya panduan yang jelas bagaimana melakukan usahanya.
As the talks get underway, the parties involved realize how very far apart their interests lie.
Perdebatannya itu sangat hangat dan bahkan kalau mau bisa dibilang panas gitu ya. Itu betul-betul head to head terutama antara private sector gitu, industri dan pihak masyarakat sipil.
In a further attempt to reduce supplies of its ramen to Malaysia, the Indonesian government submits a request to CITES ahead of its annual meeting that ramen be upgraded from Appendix 3 to Appendix 2. In support, EIA and Telapak hurriedly compile and release the ramen racket.
So we set out to create a really compelling document which would help make the argument. So we pulled together all our information on ramen dating back to the late 90s in Tanjung Puting and the trade in Malaysia, all the things that we gathered over those years.
CITES considers the issue and moves ramen to Appendix 2. This declares ramen to be potentially threatened and regulates legal trade in the species. The Malaysian government responds by declaring the move unnecessary. From trusted contacts in West Papua, information reaches the NGOs of a significant increase in the number of merbau trees being illegally logged and then illegally shipped to China. Within days, the team returns to Sorong, intent on tracing the illegal export of the timber.
EIA and Telapak's report reveals how shadowy international networks are conspiring to steal huge amounts of valuable merbau logs from Indonesia and smuggling the contraband to China using false Malaysian documents, often with the complicity of the Indonesian authorities. With huge cargo ships arriving daily, it is a trade of breathtaking scale and destructiveness. Merbau logs are the most common timber found at the port. This luxurious, dark hardwood is used in the manufacture of flooring. In the last 5 years, hundreds of factories have sprung up in Nanshun, churning out thousands of kilometres of merbau wood flooring. There are over 200 sawmills in the town processing merbau logs, the vast majority of which have been stolen from Papua. The Shanghai-based firm Sihi Wood revealed to EIA and Telapak undercover investigators that they regularly export merbau flooring to the UK, Canada and the USA.
For merbau, I think every month we export about 20,000, 25,000, I think.
25,000 square metres.
The massive illegal trade in merbau between Indonesia and China is threatening the last pristine forest in the Asia-Pacific region. While a chain of brokers and middlemen are earning vast profits, the communities of Papua are being robbed to feed China's rapacious timber industry.
Lembaga Investigasi Lingkungan atau EIA mengungkapkan Papua.
The last frontier makes headlines around the world and dominates the news agenda in Indonesia for several days.
Lembaga Investigasi Lingkungan yang berbasis di London, EIA dan Telapak di Indonesia.
There's widespread public anger that the country's forests are being illegally destroyed by domestic timber mafias and sold to China at discount prices. The President requests a copy of the report and video investigation and calls an emergency cabinet meeting. He then addresses the nation.
Kejahatan illegal logging juga sangat meresahkan. Instruksi saya singkat dan jelas. Selamatkan hutan kita, hukum para penebang dan pencuri kayu secara liar itu.
From the capital Jakarta, the President dispatches a military task force of 1,500 personnel to Sorong. The task force confiscates huge stores of illegally logged merbau and stops all pending illegal exports to China, where the lack of supply causes the price to double. Kaspar, the corrupt military police officer responsible for the illegal logging on the Kanasaimos people's lands, disappears.
So from a campaigning point of view, the impact of the Last Frontier report was better than we could have ever anticipated. We expected something, but we didn't expect something so dramatic and so quick, which basically marked a turning point in Indonesia's struggle against illegal logging. It finally reached the right level, and we sensed for the first time there was genuine commitment to actually do something on this issue. And so it was a great moment in the campaign, really.
Astounded by the volume and variety of timber from all across Southeast Asia that the team saw in China, EIA decides to launch a separate campaign looking into illegal logging in Southeast Asia and the illegal transport of that timber across the region. As international consumer demand for tropical hardwoods continues to boom, the West grapples with the ongoing issue of trying to determine the legality of wood and wood products arriving at its ports. The European Union adopts the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Regulation, also known as FLEGT. It's based on the principles of the Bali Declaration. The regulation introduces voluntary partnership agreements, bilateral arrangements with individual countries relating solely to timber. The purpose of EU VPAs is to ensure that timber and timber products exported to the EU originate only from legal sources. VPAs also aim to improve forest governance and law enforcement.
As far as we were concerned, we could see that this was a really positive thing. It was something where you had the private sector, the government, civil society coming together to come with some solutions to reform, to build.
Ahead of the VPA negotiations between the European Union and Indonesia, EIA and Telapak are invited to Brussels to brief a group of concerned MEPs and EU officials. Accompanying them is Fred Sagisolo of the Kanasai Mos people in West Papua. Indonesia's ambassador to the EU and other interested parties also attend.
Di sana hutan yang sangat terbatas. Hutan yang menjadi kebanggaan masyarakat adat. Ternyata atas penekanan. Bekerja sama dengan pemerintah Indonesia dalam menanggulangi perdagangan kayu ilegal. Terima kasih.
You could have heard a pin drop when he spoke. And you could see the responsibility, you could see the sheer responsibility and weight on his shoulders for his forest and his community when he was speaking directly to the audience. And he absolutely landed in terms of being able to bring home the reality of the situation and what needed to be done. Far better that than me speaking on their behalf or another report landing on their desk.
Back in Indonesia, the NGOs returned to West Papua to follow up on the final frontier.
2 years on, none of the major criminals behind the pillage of Papua have been convicted. Most of those arrested have been freed by the courts. One of those arrested was an influential police officer called Martin Renner. He was caught red-handed with over $100,000 in his bank account from companies involved in illegal logging. Incredibly, the court let him walk free.
Hasil akhirnya ini sangat mengecewakan. Yang ini sebetulnya menandakan bahwa memang untuk penegakan hukum dan proses judicial di Indonesia itu masih sangat lemah.
Although the situation in Indonesia had improved after the Last Frontier report, it was in some ways a challenging and quite frustrating time as well, because the people we were exposing, the main timber barons and their accomplices, they weren't facing any legal action. They were able to act with impunity.
Information from contacts in Sumatra prompts the NGOs to undertake a new investigation.
In Riau province, investigators found smuggling to be rife, especially in the Kaoem River area. Whilst there, they were shown an unusual smuggling technique.
Plantation. Coconut plantation. Why did I have so much coconut? Why did I have so much coconut? Supaya ditutup lah. Oh, supaya ketutup.
Illegal logging in Kaoem also involves a corrupt police officer called Asma.
Selain dari model polisi saya juga organisasi. Selain dari polisi saya juga organisasi gitu ya. Jadi nanti kalau memang dia mau seperti tadi saya, oke lah saya ngambil seperti kayu merah ya, peranti merah gitu ya. Jadi saya ambil peranti merah aja, maksudnya khusus tempat gitu. Nggak boleh, bisa gitu.
Most of the timber, stolen from Riau, makes the short journey across the Malacca Straits to Malaysia, where the company, Lee Beng Co, is one of the main dealers in stolen wood.
印尼来是非法的啫喎，印尼偷来是非法的，我人是偷第一杯喎。印尼政府袂使出口啲物件嘅。
So this was a really difficult time. Every time we thought we'd got somewhere, we would find that there was even more going on, and it just got bigger and bigger. And it was really overwhelming, you know? But then we suddenly pulled ourselves together, because it's like you're not just looking at logs coming from a park and going from A to B. These were syndicates. These were whole syndicates of criminals who were involved on a long chain, if you like, of illegal custody of timber. It was crossing borders. It was looking at different politics. It was dealing with completely different levels of enforcement even. And the corruption was just rife throughout.
For the forthcoming EU VPA negotiations, the Indonesian government puts together a team which also includes academia, business and civil society. Telapak is asked to join.
Ini merupakan keberhasilan dari advokasi seluruh pihak, termasuk masyarakat sipil, gitu ya. Karena artinya suara semua pemangku kepentingan ada atau terwakili. Dan artinya juga karena kita ada di dalam ruang negosiasi itu, kita bisa memonitor pelaksanaan negosiasi dan memastikan bahwa tidak ada penyimpangan-penyimpangan.
After a decade of campaigning, EIA's DC office is invited to make its case directly to the US government to amend the country's import law to include the protection of plant species.
I now recognize Mr. von Bismarck.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Bordallo, for the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee. Despite the law that makes sawn timber exported from Indonesia expressly illegal, U.S. trade data shows that over 1,500 shipments declared on customs forms as Indonesian sawn timber worth some 30 million entered U.S. ports between November 2004 and November 2006. That's more than 2 shipments a day.
A year later, the US government amends the existing Lacey Act to include plant species. The Act was first passed in 1900 to prevent wildlife being illegally imported into the Federal Union.
So the US Lacey Act prohibits the trade in plants and plant products that have been illegally sourced from a foreign country. It also requires companies that are importing goods to declare the country of origin and the species name of any plants in their products. And finally, it also establishes a penalties regime, which includes forfeiture of goods and vessels, and fines, and potentially jail time as well.
Back in Indonesia, the government announces plans to almost triple the size of the country's palm oil industry, from 7 million to 20 million hectares. The only parts of Indonesia big enough to accommodate the massive expansion are the country's heavily forested Papuan provinces. The government declares that 5 million hectares of Indonesian Papua will be cleared and converted to palm oil plantations.
Ini sangat mengkhawatirkan, meskipun sebetulnya tidak mengejutkan. Dan pemerintah tentu saja ingin memanfaatkan perkembangan ini untuk meningkatkan pendapatan negara. Cuma ini juga artinya ancaman yang sangat besar terhadap keberadaan hutan Indonesia, terutama di Papua. Dan juga ancaman terhadap masyarakat adat dan masyarakat lokal yang hidupnya bergantung pada hutan.
From this point onwards, EIA and Telapak operate a dual focus in Indonesia. They continue their work against illegal logging of high-value species And they undertake a new campaign against the massive clearance of forests for palm oil plantations. The NGOs decide to dispatch a team to West Papua to look into the current situation there.
Dengan tingkat kesuburan tanah yang begitu baik di Papua, kami yakin dalam beberapa tahun mendatang, Papua akan menjadi salah satu pusat pengembangan sawit terbesar dan terbaik di dunia.
Kedatangan perusahaan Raja Wali ini itu bukan permintaan dari masyarakat, tapi itu permintaan atau keinginan besar dari pemerintahan provinsi dan kabupaten. Nah, kami sudah menolak 3 kali. Ternyata keempat ini karena didesak terus oleh pemerintah kabupaten dan itu disetujui oleh Pak Menteri Kehutanan, maka itu sudah punya SK. Jadi saya pikir itu kami masyarakat seluruhnya walaupun bagaimana, tapi itulah karena sudah punya SK, kami sifat menerima saja.
So land rights in Indonesia are very often contentious. There are indigenous customary land rights, which are long-standing rights of local indigenous people. And then there are the rights that the state establishes for itself through the law. And there is always a contention and confusion in navigating those two systems of rights.
Since decentralisation back in 2000, regional governments have been mostly responsible for managing forest and land-related permits and licenses.
Dengan tanpa governance yang baik, maka izin-izin yang diberikan oleh bupati itu dan tanpa kontrol ya, lalu konversi hutan besar-besaran dari hutan bagus dan proses tata ruang menjadi hutan konversi, kegiatan olahraganya merebak.
Palm oil plantation licenses are normally issued by local governments after a company has approached them seeking land and seeking to invest. Very often there is little consultation with local people. The decision has been made at that provincial or regional level. And local people can be unaware or often do not consent to these things, but the plantation will proceed regardless and the permits will be issued.
However, if an area of targeted forest is already officially designated as state forest, the permit application to cut it down and convert the land to a palm oil plantation must be approved by central government in Jakarta, specifically by the Ministry of Forestry.
It's the one point where they could intervene and prevent it happening, but that rarely happens. And normally permits are issued and the land is cleared and the forest is destroyed.
Perusahaan ini dia janji bilang ibu, nanti ke depan itu ibu bisa lebih kaya lagi daripada sekarang. Sekarang ini ibu masih miskin. Nanti ke depan ibu bisa kaya lebih. Nanti ibu mau minta apa? Minta mobil. Nanti perusahaan bisa kasih. Nanti ibu punya rumah tuh bisa mewah. Nanti tidak seperti macam begini lagi. Terpaksa suami saya ikut tanda tangan dalam surat perusahaan itu, tanda tangan untuk serahkan kelapa sawit. Saya punya nyong yang kecil juga, dia juga ikut tanda tangan dari perusahaan. Dia ikut tanda tangan, dia umur sejak 4 tahun. Dulu tuh di sini tuh masih hutan semua. Di sini masih hutan. Tapi sekarang ini tidak hutan lagi. Sekarang kami lihat saja lah, dorang tanam kelapa sawit saja. Hutan tidak ada. Sampai saya biasa kasih tahu untuk kami punya keluarga yang lain-lain. Saya bilang, jangan kalau perusahaan kelapa sawit ini masuk di areal kamu jangan ambil, jangan terima.
After 6 years of talks to define the legality of timber, agreement is finally reached between Indonesia's civil society, timber industry and government.
Karena prosesnya berlangsung bertahun-tahun dan cukup intensif waktu itu, pada akhirnya seluruh stakeholder bisa memahami posisi masing-masing pihak dan dapat bernegosiasi dan melakukan kesepakatan.
The Indonesian government passes the timber legality verification system into law. It becomes known as the SVLK.
SVLK ini sendiri sebetulnya merupakan salah satu terobosan karena di sistem verifikasi atau sistem yang mandatori ini untuk pertama kalinya peranan masyarakat sipil diakui secara formal sebagai pemantau dari sistem ini. Ini merupakan salah satu keberhasilan dari advokasi masyarakat sipil Indonesia sehingga proses check and balances di dalam sistem ini bisa dijaga.
Indonesia's relatively new Public Information Act becomes both the core and mechanism of transparency within the SVLK.
Dan para pemantau di Indonesia menggunakan Undang-Undang KIP dan prinsip transparansi di dalam SVLK dan juga VPA ini untuk melakukan pemantauan terhadap pelaksanaan SVLK yang hasilnya digunakan juga untuk melakukan keluhan atau pengaduan baik kepada lembaga sertifikasi maupun kepada pemerintah sendiri. Hasilnya bisa dilihat bahwa ada beberapa sertifikat yang dibekukan, sertifikat yang dicabut, atau bahkan beberapa operasi penegakan hukum yang di-trigger atau dipicu oleh laporan pemantau yang menggunakan informasi berdasarkan Undang-Undang KIP dan peraturan SVLK terkait dengan keterbukaan informasi publik ini.
All of Indonesian industry came out in support of the scheme.
The voluntary partnership agreement between the European Union and Indonesia is at last negotiated and ready to be signed into law.
Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Voluntary Partnership Agreement.
This means that Indonesia will be eligible to use the EU's FLEGT licensing system when it comes online.
Di dalam FLEGT VPA, negara produsen memastikan bahwa ia hanya mengirim kayu-kayu legal ke pasar Uni Eropa.
You know, people say VPAs take way too long. When you actually look at what is being achieved here, you're looking at reforming entire systems, building new institutions. You're actually giving time for people to put their ideas and suggestions forward. You're talking about having meetings with governments and civil society, trade. You're talking about bringing people together so that they can come up with these solutions and own it. And so, yeah, it will take a long time, but it's an extremely positive process.
To level the playing field, Indonesia's government, civil society and others ask the European Union to introduce its own legislation, prohibiting the import of illegally logged timber and timber products from anywhere in the world. Back in Indonesia, the president announces a temporary moratorium on the cutting down of primary forests and the clearing of virgin peatlands. The moratorium covers an area of 64 million hectares.
Instruksi Presiden mengenai moratorium pemberian izin di kawasan hutan primer dan lahan gambut ini merupakan satu langkah yang patut diapresiasi. Meskipun sebetulnya akan lebih baik lagi jika perlindungan ini diberikan kepada seluruh hutan alam.
With export bans, moratoria, international agreements, increased law enforcement and the definition of legality now in place, the amount of illegally logged timber being illegally exported from Indonesia has reduced hugely. However, the threats to Indonesia's forests from within are on the rise. As requested by Indonesia's government, civil society and others, Brussels introduces the European Union Timber Regulation. The EUTR, as it becomes known, prohibits illegally harvested timber or timber products from anywhere in the world being imported into the EU. Though separate, the EUTR and the forthcoming EU VPA FLEGT licensing system exist in parallel.
Under the European Union Timber Regulation, importers must demonstrate the ownership of the timber from the point it was cut down to the point it arrives in Europe. They must show that it was harvested legally, and they must show that specific laws were upheld in the transport of the timber to Europe.
Since leaving the European Union, the UK has continued to implement the regulation, renaming it the UKTR.
Terbitnya EU Timber Regulation itu bisa dikatakan sebuah kemenangan bagi semua pihak yang memang menginginkan negara konsumen mengambil tanggung jawabnya dalam isu perdagangan ilegal kayu dan produk kayu.
Karena membatasi hak masyarakat hukum adat untuk memanfaatkan hasil kekayaan alam yang berada di wilayah adatnya.
In a case brought by the Indigenous Peoples Alliance, Indonesia's Constitutional Court overturned Suharto's 1967 law, which transferred control of most of the country's land to the state. The ruling clears a legal path for indigenous peoples to reclaim their ancestral or customary lands.
Ini sebetulnya keputusan yang sangat luar biasa, karena artinya negara mengakui hutan adat di dalam wilayah adat. Sayangnya, menyusul putusan MK 35 ini, langkah yang diambil pemerintah untuk mengakui hutan adat ternyata membuat pelaksanaannya sangat sulit.
Suharto's 30-year regime had refused to recognize indigenous peoples and their ancestral or customary rights and lands. All natural resources were controlled by the state.
Jadi terlihat seperti ada keengganan dari pemerintah untuk mengakui keberadaan masyarakat adat, termasuk mengakui teritori atau wilayah masyarakat adat dan hutan adatnya.
However, despite the government-imposed obstacles, many indigenous peoples begin the process of trying to reclaim their ancestral or customary forests and lands. Across Indonesia, some palm oil companies are using the government's drive to hugely expand the sector as a license to act with impunity.
Banyaknya penebangan atau penebangan ilegal atau adanya illegal logging dilakukan oleh perkebunan sawit. Dari awal tidak ada perkebunan sawit yang benar di Kalimantan Tengah masuk. Mereka membuka lahan, ada yang berkedok izin yang cuma sekian, tapi besarannya 2 kali lipat dari izin tersebut. Dan juga mereka menebang hutan-hutan di dalam konsesi itu, baik pun konflik teritorial, konflik dengan masyarakat.
Perusahaan-perusahaan kelapa sawit yang bisa membuka dan menebangi hutan dalam jumlah yang luas, bahkan sebelum izinnya beroperasi, atau yang izinnya keluar dari proses-proses yang korup, ini tentu saja kemudian menghasilkan kayu-kayu yang tidak sah juga atau ilegal. Dan ini menjadi modus baru sebetulnya dalam pembalakan liar, yaitu dengan menggunakan izin kelapa sawit untuk membuka hutan. Dan sepanjang proses pemberian izin yang syarat korupsi itu tidak diperbaiki atau tidak diatasi, masalah ini akan selalu ada.
And what of the palm oil produced on plantations throughout Indonesia? How can consumers know whether the palm oil in the products they buy has been ethically and sustainably grown and produced? As Indonesia and several other palm oil producing countries don't have effective legislation which addresses these issues, the industry and others have put forward a system of voluntary regulation and certification.
This is the story of a con involving a natural product that we all use every day, sometimes without being aware of it. It's also the story of a watchdog with no bite and something known as greenwashing.
When an organisation says it's doing something green and that's got good environmental credentials, but it's not, that's greenwashing.
The product is palm oil, a vegetable oil that can be found in almost 50% of everything we buy, from ice cream to lipstick. And it's a business worth more than $70 billion a year. And it's the body that labels palm oil as sustainable that's doing the greenwashing. It now has more than 4,500 members in over 90 countries. The RSPO introduced a set of guiding principles and a certification process to guarantee the supply of sustainable palm oil. However, the Environmental Investigation Agency partnered with the Malaysian NGO Grassroots and produced a damning report, Who Watches the Watchman? Among other things, we discovered
widespread flaws in the certification.
Auditors were supplying fraudulent assessments to cover up violations in the RSPO standards, and there were failures in identifying indigenous land right claims.
There were serious labour abuses on plantations, including the illegal employment of children.
There were flagrant conflicts of interest and corruption.
And certifications awarded to companies with weak understanding of the standards they were supposed to uphold.
Stung by the report, the RSPO sets up the Assurance Task Force to address its list of failings. Following a change in leadership, Telapak alters its direction. To preserve the focus, values and ideals of the original organisation, most of the founders and nationwide membership leave and form a new NGO, which they call Kaoem Telapak. Japan introduces the Clean Wood Act, which specifies that all wood and wood products entering the country must have been harvested legally. 15 years after the Bali Conference, 6 years on from the timber legality verification system becoming law in Indonesia, and 2 years after the European Union and Indonesia signed their voluntary partnership agreement, the EU's Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Licensing System, also known as FLEGT, finally comes online.
FLEGT licensed products from Indonesia are free to sail straight into Europe's ports and then travel around the rest of the Union, while similar products from neighbouring countries are delayed as they need to prove due diligence and can be refused entry.
Yang menurut kami kalau ini menunjukkan juga bahwa dengan adanya political will dari pemerintah, partisipasi penuh dari para pihak dan proses yang transparan dan akuntabel, reformasi di sektor kehutanan bisa dicapai.
The licensing was really important for quite a lot of things, but firstly, after all the hard work and slog that it had taken all this time, Indonesia had stayed with that commitment and landed, and there they were with the license. Secondly, they were the first country in the world, actually, but more importantly in the region, to have got a FLEGT license. This really helped drive the other countries who were looking at BPAs in moving forward in what they wanted. But thirdly, and more importantly, I suppose, to Indonesia, it meant that the value of their furniture and wood products into the EU market grew.
South Korea revises its legislation on the sustainable use of timber to prevent unverified wood entering the country. The President of Indonesia introduces a 3-year moratorium on the issuing of permits for new palm oil plantations. And a year later, he makes permanent the moratorium on the cutting down of primary forest and the clearing of virgin peatland.
Keputusan Presiden untuk memberlakukan moratorium pemberian izin di hutan primer dan lahan gambut menjadi permanen itu sangat kami apresiasi. Meskipun idealnya perlindungan ini dikeluarkan dalam bentuk produk hukum atau kebijakan, bukan sekedar instruksi Presiden.
And how have things changed regarding palm oil? Can consumers now buy RSPO-certified palm oil from Indonesia or elsewhere, confident that it's been ethically and sustainably grown and produced?
Four years on, we're producing a new report, which has found that hardly anything has changed, and some violations have got worse. Some of the biggest companies in the world, like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Johnson & Johnson, are all members of the RSPO.
They should be really worried about this because this is undermining the whole credibility of the RSPO system, and these companies, a lot of them are buying the RSPO certified palm oil at a cost to themselves, and if the RSPO is not upholding any of its own rules and this palm oil isn't what it says it is on the tin, then that's a major problem for the industry.
And what about us?
Consumers should be worried because they're buying this certified palm oil on the understanding that it does not cause harm to the environment, that it's not destroying wildlife or forests, and it's not exploiting local people, when in fact the RSPO is not keeping to those rules and it is doing those things.
Jadi saya rasa balik lagi kembali jika kita ingin memastikan bahwa pengelolaan atau memastikan industri sawit yang berkelanjutan itu kembali harus berawal dari pembenahan tata kelola di sektor ini, dan ini harus berlaku mandatori bagi seluruh pelaku usaha perkebunan dan juga industrinya.
China, the world's largest importer of timber, amends its forestry law to ban the purchase, process or transport of illegally sourced wood. In 2019, over €1 billion worth of EU FLEGT licensed timber and timber products from Indonesia are seamlessly imported into the European Union.
Ini sebetulnya merupakan prestasi besar bagi Indonesia. Artinya, karena dulunya Indonesia dikenal sebagai negara dengan tingkat illegal logging tertinggi, kami di Kaoem Telapak merasa bangga bahwa kami merupakan bagian dari proses ini.
The latest Indonesian government statistics reveal that annual deforestation has fallen to its lowest level since records began in 1990. In 2019, 150,000 hectares of forest were destroyed, compared to a high of almost 1.1 million hectares in 2014. The government says this huge drop is due to the combined successes of its anti-deforestation policies. NGOs add that the falling price of palm oil and the global COVID crisis have also contributed to the low figure.
Dengan perbaikan tata kelola di sektor kehutanan, hutan Indonesia bisa terlindungi dan livelihood atau penghidupan masyarakat yang bekerja di sektor kehutanan dan industri kayu itu bisa meningkat.
Around Indonesia, many indigenous peoples strive to live, and in some cases reclaim their traditional lives and customs. Their environment and their lands are central to their traditional ways of life.
Sebenarnya hutan adat bagi masyarakat adat Kaoem ini adalah hubungan yang sangat arif, sehingga merupakan bagian yang tidak terpisahkan dari kehidupan masyarakat adat itu sendiri. Jadi ini kayak besinya. Nama saya Frederick Sagisolo. Tugas saya, jabatan saya Ketua Dewan Adat Kaoem. Sisa-sisa yang kami pertahankan sehingga menghentikan illegal logging itu, dan ini yang kami tahan. Orang bagaimanapun tidak bisa olah kayu yang seperti ini, karena inilah orang lakukan upacara adat untuk meminta berkat itu pasti melalui pohon ini. Terus pohon ini juga dia sebagai tempat rumah untuk burung-burung itu sendiri, kus-kus apa semua ada di situ, tinggalnya di pohon ini. Tanah ini adalah mama, dia memberi kami makan. Memberi dari makanan itu, dari sagu, dari buah-buahan ini. Tetapi juga di dalamnya ada binatang-binatang yang memang kami konsumsi, butuhkan, datang dari tanah itu sendiri. Ini namanya WIMN. WIMN.
Fungsinya?
WIMN ini fungsinya adalah untuk orang minum airnya. Makanya alam ini kami bilang dia menyimpan kita. Dia juga alam ini adalah rumah sakit juga.
Apotek ya?
Ini apoteknya.
Apotek,
aja.
dapur,
iya.
Supermarket.
Apa
lagi?
Dia
tempat bermain.
Tempat bermain, dia mendidik juga.
Tempat mencari makanan.
Mencari makan. Berburu. Jadi semuanya di situ. Memang waktu itu satu hal yang dibuat oleh teman-teman dari Kaoem Telapak itu, kami merasa merupakan pihak yang datang menyelamatkan kami sebenarnya. Dia menjadi penyelamat untuk kadang, karena kami juga tidak tahu atas cara ini, dan ini menjadi cerita sampai sekarang. Untuk illegal logging yang luar biasa menghancurkan hutan, dia begitu hilang, dan sampai sekarang kami merasa memang lega. Dan itulah proses perjuangan kami sampai ke sana.
Padahal sebetulnya pengakuan masyarakat adat termasuk wilayahnya dan hutan adatnya merupakan salah satu langkah kunci untuk bisa memastikan perlindungan terhadap hutan sendiri.
Throughout Indonesia, much has improved, but in the palm oil sector, some instances of bad practice continue.
Kenapa Pak yang dipaksa-paksa kayak gini Pak? Apa masalahnya? Ayo ikut semua, ayo. Nggak bisa. Bukan penjahat Pak. Bapak ini.
Saya berani pastikan ini memang cara perusahaan untuk membungkam kami. Membungkam kami sehingga kami jangan melakukan perlawanan. Artinya harus turuti kehendak mereka. Karena sebelumnya ada 4 orang teman saya yang sudah duluan ditangkap. Di kampung ini mana orang-orang yang tidak pro, mereka upayakan untuk dikriminalisasi, untuk membungkam perjuangan kami mempertahankan hutan adat ini. Hutan kami ini hilang karena perkebunan sawit ini. Jadi dengan adanya pembukaan perkebunan dengan skala besar ini, dia menghilangkan semuanya, baik tumbuhannya, hewannya, apapun yang kami perlukan di tanah ini ya semuanya hilang. Sementara itu yang kami perlukan bukan cuma untuk kehidupan ekonomi, juga untuk kehidupan spiritual dan sebagainya. Dari keseluruhan wilayah adat kita ini 16.300 hektar itu yang sudah tergarap perkiraan sekitar 2.000 hektar. Secara ekonomi yang kita rasakan, kita hilang usaha masyarakat yang dulunya misalnya berburu, mencari bahan-bahan di hutan, mencari makanan, mencari ikan. Ini sudah mulai terasa.
Itu yang sayang sekali dan sedihnya justru akhir-akhir ini justru semakin banyak aktivis lingkungan atau aktivis hak masyarakat yang memperoleh intimidasi, ancaman, bahkan kekerasan, mengalami kekerasan baik secara fisik maupun secara hukum maupun secara media.
Over 20 years on from the fall of Suharto and the rampant illegal logging that took place in the years that followed, much has been done by the state and others to facilitate the recovery of the country's national parks and forests. But much more remains to be done.
Perkenalkan, nama saya Henry. Saya dari Kumai. Saya dulu itu nebang, habis ditebang itu kami bawa truk dan kami tarik pakai truk tadi. Yang jadi incaran itu ada beberapa jenis kayu seperti bengkirai, ramin, dan itu sangat mahal. Awalnya sih belum ada gendala-gendala yang seperti apa itu belum ada. Jadi kami terus terlena untuk penebangan pohon, apa itu mengakibatkan kerusakan hutan. Kami tidak berpikir seperti itu karena hanya itu yang bisa kami kerjakan. Dan lama-kelamaan itu pun ada kendala juga, seperti ada tim kan. Dan pada tahun 2012 ada tawaran dari Pak Basuki, mantan manajer kami di FNBF. Dia ngajak gabung di FNBF, kerjaannya menanam, melestarikan alam. Jadi pelan-pelan saya belajar dan saya akhirnya menyadari betapa besarnya kesalahan saya selama saya menjadi perusak hutan. Dan saya pun bertekad akan menebus dan membayar kesalahan saya untuk menanam pohon kembali dan menghijaukan hutan yang sudah kami rusak. Dan kami akan menanam pohon kembali dan juga termasuk pohon-pohon buah-buahan yang bermanfaat untuk makan orang hutan. Target penanaman kami tahun ini itu 1,5 juta pohon dan melanjut akan ke tahun 2025 itu 11,5 juta pohon yang akan kami tanam. Kalau pekerjaan saya yang dulu, kita bekerja tidak pernah tenang. Karena pekerjaan kita selalu dihantui. Pekerjaan mengembalikan hutan tuh saya terasa tenang.
Ya itu harus dikelola dengan cara-cara kelestarian yang diakui oleh para pihak yang memang secara umum ya itu diakui oleh para pihak, bukan oleh pemerintah semata atau pengusaha. Jadi kalau semua sudah mengakui, maka kita percaya masyarakat adat pun, pemerintah, pengusaha bisa melakukannya dengan lestari. Itu harus dibuat. Dan sudah ada sebetulnya.
Brought together by a common aim. Held together by a mutual commitment to save the forests and the cumulative gains of their hard-won victories. Through the good years and the bad. Through sacrifice, success, and the toll of the journey, EIA and Kaoem Telapak are still in the fight. The fight to save Indonesia's remaining forests.
We stood shoulder to shoulder. Everything we did was together. Our reports were joint branded, our press releases were joint branded. We consulted each other on every step of the way. It was a true partnership and one I'll remember forever.
I've always been very inspired by the courage of individuals within Telapak to really take huge risks that you and I would not need to take in the West, to push on agendas that have not been welcomed by local or national governments in Indonesia. And that's been a huge inspiration for myself and many of the people at EIA.
Salah satu hal yang paling saya banggakan dari bekerja dengan Telapak sebetulnya sebagai anggota Telapak dan kini anggota Kaoem Telapak, bahwa kami sebagai organisasi yang kecil bisa memberikan impact yang cukup besar.
Yes, EIA and Telapak's campaign has saved forests. We've seen tangible results where forests are now still standing, where there wasn't any chance before. Two small organizations have changed things far beyond a normal reach.
Forests are the last line of defense. Once they go, what you'll find is that companies, individuals, criminals, unscrupulous people are going to get in there, they're going to dig, they're going to mine, they're going to extract, they're going to create conflict, they're going to displace people off their lands. And that's why it's so important that we protect forests.
Topik tertentu, subjek tertentu, sasaran tertentu gitu. Jadi beberapa kita menang ya, berhasil kita menangkan. Tapi memang kalau dilihat secara keseluruhan, kayaknya kita belum menang perang itu.
The work that EIA and Telapak started in Indonesia had a ripple effect across the world. It really placed not just illegal logging, but the wide-scale destruction of tropical forests. It put that in the global spotlight. The people who work in EIA and in Telapak put their lives at risk to do very, very important work. And they're hugely professional in the work that they do, and they take those risks knowingly.
Hutan-hutan kita lah sebetulnya yang paling bagus. Bukannya di negeri kita, di negeri mereka juga sama. Memelihara, kemudian mengelola dengan lestari, menanam, merehabilitasi cara-cara biofuel. Itu sebenarnya satu usaha besar penyelamatan bumi.
The global production of poorly regulated commodities such as palm oil, soy and beef is the major driver of the deforestation of our planet. 1.6 billion people, around 20% of the global population, rely on forests for part or all of their livelihoods. The Earth's remaining forests cover about 30% of the planet's landmass and are home to around 80% of animal and plant species. As temperatures rise and pressures mount, governments around the world are drafting new laws aimed at reducing deforestation in the commodity supply chain. The world's remaining forests are the planet's last defense against its greatest threat, accelerated climate change. Every day as EIA, Kaoem Telapak and many others around the world go to work, on the ground and in the capitals of power, they do so determined to develop new solutions, to slow down deforestation, and to do whatever they possibly can to save the world's remaining forests. Our survival and the survival of our planet depend on it.